Hello and welcome to the Music Professor channel. I'm Matthew King and Hello and welcome to the Music Professor channel. I'm Matthew King and I'm here with Loki, who's yawning, but he's delighted to be here to present today's discussion, which is going to be about Pierre Boulez, whose 100th birthday happens this week. 26th of March 1925 was when he was born. So it's an auspicious day for those of us who admire Boulez, and I realise that it's not really a popular topic, but I think it's really important that we talk about a major figure of the 20th century today. And before we get going on that, just a big thank you to subscribers and our wonderful community of donors. Please feel free to not only subscribe and press the little bell so you get the notifications, but also consider donating to the channel, because we're just a little channel and we create all this content for our wonderful audience and we don't get any payment for that. So we're delighted to receive your wonderful donations. So really encourage you, if you like the channel and think it's worthwhile, do consider donating. So today's discussion is, it's going to be focused on Pierre Boulez, and he's a controversial figure. When I was growing up and a young apprentice musician and composer, Pierre Boulez was a sort of godlike figure, really. He was a huge figure in contemporary music. And he had this sort of patrician position where you'd look to see what Boulez had composed recently, and he'd come over to London and perform in these rather in a way rather austere, but at the same time exciting and often thrilling performances, because he's an amazing conductor, he's an amazing musician. He was somebody gifted with an absolutely prodigious ear, so he could hear the tiniest variations of pitch. He was incredibly on the money with rhythm and with balance. So he was born to conduct in a way, and one of the most exciting performers of the mid to late 20th century. But he's also a composer of enormous significance and a controversial figure, because he'd often make rather grand and dogmatic pronouncements. And when I was growing up, it was difficult to escape from these things he said. And I think today, because it's his birthday, I don't actually want to get absorbed into the controversy around those statements. I feel as if the world has moved on so dramatically since that time that, in a sense, the controversies around Pierre Boulez don't really matter much now. Musical culture has changed vastly. And so I think what matters today is just to reflect on the man and the music a little bit. This is not going to be a long video. Just thinking about Boulez today, one of the striking things, and I know this from recollections of people who worked with him and also from a conversation that I once had with him, that he was a likeable person. I think there's this idea of him as a scary, forbidding, dogmatic person. In a sense, he was those things, but he was also a man who wasn't particularly egotistical. If you were in a room with him, he wasn't going to vaunt his greatness and make everyone feel small. He wasn't that kind of guy. In fact, he was the opposite of that. He was kind of a generous, egalitarian kind of person. In our era, which is dominated by bombastic narcissists, it's sort of there's a charm about reflecting on a person who was genuinely a great musician and a big figure, but was not like that. He wasn't those things. He was an artist of real integrity. He had an ideology, certainly, but he was also a music lover. He was somebody who lived for music, almost a monkish kind of life devoted to the art of music. And I find some of that rather touching. Great performer, great conductor, great composer in many ways. So the topic really today is, we're just going to focus in on one tiny piece of Pierre Boulez. It's from an early set called Notation, which are 12 pieces for piano, originally written in 1945 when Boulez was 20. So when he was a student at the Paris Conservatoire, he was a sort of star student in the class of Olivier Messiaen, also a great composer, perhaps an even greater composer, I would say. So Messiaen's class, Boulez is in there and receiving this amazing tuition from Messiaen, who was a great teacher, having his eyes open to the music of the world. He was, in fact, considering a career in ethnomusicology, and he was studying the music of Bali and the music of Japan and also African drumming at that time. So he was he was really steeping himself in other traditions, and he composed these extraordinary pieces. So notation, 12 pieces, each piece has 12 bars, and each piece consists of a note row, all 12 notes of the chromatic scale, arranged in a particular order. That's what a note row is. And it's a system of composition that had been devised by Arnold Schoenberg in the 20s. Boulez had recently started taking a sort of, I think, evening classes with a Schoenberg apostle called René Leibowitz. And they didn't get on. Leibowitz was rather dogmatic about Schoenbergian 12-tone composition. Boulez reacted to that. He wasn't the kind of guy who enjoyed being told that this is how it is. And so he went, as soon as he encountered the idea of 12-tone composition, he thought, I'm going to have a go at this, but in a completely different way from the way I'm being taught. And I find this admirable and fascinating. And for those of you who think of Boulez as some kind of doctrinaire serial composer, he actually wasn't those things. His attitude towards 12-note rows and that whole type of composition was very, very un-Schoenbergian and in a way absolutely individual to him. He did it his way, and I'm going to show you a little bit about that now, because the approach is wonderfully fresh in a way, and it's very much a young person just doing it themselves, doing it their way. What's fascinating about these little pieces is how concise they are. It's an amazing thing to find a young artist, and I encourage young composers to be like this in a way, a young artist just looking at the fabric of a musical style and saying, how can I do this in a fresh way? And he really does. And bear in mind also that the world in 1945 was utterly unlike our own. It was a world that had just been torn apart by apocalyptic events. And the young Pierre Boulez had been living in the middle of that. He'd come through the occupation. Nazis had been in control of France and had been in residence in Paris right up until the time when the Notation were composed. Paris had only very, very recently been liberated. And so here he is living under the dark cloud of totalitarianism. And this music comes out of that. And it's young people saw the world differently then. They saw the world of Romanticism in the 19th century as a dead world that had perhaps given rise to many of the terrible things that they'd witnessed. They absolutely rejected that. And they also rejected what the previous generation of composers had done, particularly people like Stravinsky, but also for the previous generation of French composers, Francis Poulenc being an example. They rejected the idioms of the previous generation and the tendency towards neoclassicism. Stravinsky had been a prominent neoclassical composer, but Boulez's generation rejected all that. They were having nothing to do with neoclassicism, which they associated to some extent with fascism, because the fascists had been quite keen on sort of reconstructing Greco-Roman architectural styles and that kind of thing, and they wanted nothing to do with it. So I think whenever we look at Boulez and his hostility to the previous generation, particularly Stravinsky, we have to bear that in mind. There's much more to Stravinsky's neoclassicism than any of that, by the way, but we're not going to go into that right now. So here we are in a brave new world. In 1945, Pierre Boulez, the young 20-year-old Pierre Boulez, is trying to recreate music. And he wants to do it without tonality and really without reference to the music of the past at all. And bear in mind, he's interested in ethnomusicology, which I've mentioned already. But for him also, key figures of the previous generation are Stravinsky on the one hand, particularly the rhythmic innovations of the Rite of Spring, with its wonderful supercharged new vision of how you can organise the rhythm in this kind of fantastical, incendiary, ritualistic way. And on the other hand, he thought that Schoenberg and the Second Viennese School, Schoenberg, and particularly Webern, Schoenberg's student Webern, to Pierre Boulez's thinking, they'd found a viable solution to a non-tonal musical syntax. Using note rows in order to create material. Now, from our point of view, these concerns seem arcane, but you have to bear in mind that back then, when they were desperate to create a new musical vocabulary, these things seem to be the way forward. It's fascinating to think in that purest way that they had. It's sort of appealing and also slightly worrying. But, you know, I have to admire the way that Boulez did it. So let me show you what he did. Right, now look, let's talk about how this all works. So what Boulez does is he creates a row, a note row, and he got 12 notes. But being a brilliant and systematic kind of guy who likes creating patterns that are logical and systematic, he creates 12 notes. So the first 6 are these. And throughout the piece, they're absolutely fixed. They're an ostinato. And he keeps repeating it in this kind of vigorous way. Do you remember a minute ago I said Boulez's heroes were on the one hand Stravinsky because of his rhythmic innovations in the Rite of Spring, and on the other hand Schoenberg and his revolution in terms of pitch that he'd initiated. And Boulez actually disagreed with the way Schoenberg used 12-note rows. And his disagreement was really the fact that Schoenberg would create a theme out of some of the notes in the row and accompany the theme with other notes in the row. And he thought that was illogical, and in a sense, I think he's right. But we won't get into that now. But the most important thing is you have these two people, Stravinsky on the one hand, Schoenberg on the other. So this is the previous generation. These are the people he saw as ultimately significant. Webern as well, but we won't go into that so much. So let's think about Stravinsky and Schoenberg, because at the time, in 1945, no one who was in the Schoenberg camp, no one admired Stravinsky. And vice versa, if you were in the Stravinsky camp, you did nothing but pour derision on Schoenberg's camp. You know, these were absolutely polarised camps. And the interesting thing is, the next generation comes along and they can see value in both, and they create a language, in Boulez's case, that sort of synthesises elements of the two. You have a kind of Stravinsky rhythmic element, and you have a sort of post-Schoenbergian approach, simply in terms of the fact that he uses a note row. Now, this is very interesting because the history of music is full of people who find synthesis. We live, incidentally, in an era of polarisation, horrific polarisation. But actually, really creative solutions to the world's problems tend to come through people who have the vision to see that what we need is not it's a dialectic. You've got these opposite poles, and we need to find some sort of way of reconciling those polarities. Let's give you an example. Debussy, when he was a very young composer in the 1890s, realised that to forge a new French idiom that was going to work for the 20th century, he needed to somehow synthesize elements of the music that he admired in Russia, particularly the music of Mussorgsky, elements of what he admired in the new music around him, particularly Erik Satie's innovations in his early piano pieces, elements that he saw in composers like Grieg over in Norway, new harmonic possibilities, and then an overarching and a very, very dominant influence, the influence of Richard Wagner, who was a composer that Debussy massively admired but couldn't really admit to it because he was such a dominant figure. And so in Debussy's work you see this amazing synthesis of those elements. Let me give you another example. Arnold Schoenberg, who I've already mentioned a few times. Look at the amazing string sextet that he composed in 1899, Verklärte Nacht. Absolutely gorgeous piece, which somehow reconciles the harmonic vocabulary of Wagner's Tristan and Isolde with the sort of chamber idiom and developmental motivic technique of Brahms. In those days, no one who was in the Wagner camp admired Brahms, and no one who was in the Brahms camp admired Wagner. And yet, in Schoenberg, you see the reconciliation of the two in Verklärte Nacht, which is why it's the most important work of that decade, I would say, Verklärte Nacht, or at least one of them. No, actually there are a few, because Debussy wrote Prélude et l'Après-midi doing fun in that decade as well. So yeah, there are other contenders for that, but it was absolutely vital in the Austro-German tradition to reconcile. Do you see what I'm saying? So we're talking about ways of finding a path through. You have creative artists doing sort of diametrically opposite things who belong to the previous generation, and you say to yourself, well, hang on, I can take that from there, I can take that there, I can fuse them, and hey presto, we have a fresh new approach to composition. My co-presenter, Loki, had wandered from his place. I've only just noticed. He's come back now. So he's got things to say about serialism. The next part of the discussion is not going to be boring. Stick with me. We're going to talk about note rows, but in an exciting way. So what was the appeal of note rows? It was a way of organising pictures without reference to traditional harmony, and that's what composers were excited about. So look, let's see how you can do it. If you're logical, I said this a few minutes ago, like Boulez was, you want to find some correspondences within the row so that motifs start to appear. Okay, so let's see how this works. So he creates a little motif out of the first 6 notes of the row. So if you took from A and you went down to E, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, you end up with 6 notes. Okay, 6 notes. And if you went up from B flat to E flat, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, you've got 6 notes. So what you can do then is organise one motif out of those 6 and organise a sort of another version of the same motif out of those 6 notes. So it's a very simple thing to do. So what he does is he creates a pattern that does this. That's the motif that dominates the piece. Now, if you took those same pictures and you spun them out there, do you see you've got the same motif twice, a tritone apart, there and there, a tritone distance. So we got the same motif replicating itself at the tritone. Do you see? There's the tritone. And you can have the same motif, and you've got the 12 tones doing that. I mean, Boulez never actually does that, but that's the basic material. What he does is he actually turns the second motif the other way. So instead of going, he makes it go the other way. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that's what we call a retrograde. You turn the notes around in the other direction. So what the piece is then, is it presents you with these 2 versions of the same motif, a tritone apart. 6 notes and 6 notes, and that adds up to 12. And this is what's cool. The first 6 are presented absolutely rigidly. We hear them over and over again, like somebody kind of insisting on something, which in fact is kind of what it is. It's this insistent character that keeps saying the same thing over and over in an increasingly sort of annoyed way. At least that seems to me to be the intent of the piece. And like all Boulez's music, it does have an intensity. When I first encountered Boulez's music, I think it was Répond, an extraordinary ensemble piece in the 1980s, I thought, wow. I didn't come across it as some sort of academic exercise. It was absolutely visceral, this incredible sort of rhythmic drive that it had, and the colours. It was very colourful music. So I would say, actually, Boulez's music isn't an academic exercise. It's intense, and it kind of takes you by the scruff of the neck in a very, very immediate way, and that's perhaps what I find attractive about it. So the first 6 notes, followed by the others. Now, the interesting thing is, we get this 6-note pattern going over and over again. The right hand isn't like that at all. Do you remember I said the notes are presented as a retrograde? But actually what you hear is an improvisation. This is very important in understanding how Boulez conceived of composition. On the one hand, he said you use very strict things. We've already noticed there's a kind of strictness about this. But then there's a free element. And see how free he is with the other 5 notes. The other 5 notes should be there. But actually, he unveils those 6 notes in a gradual way. Look, he does this. Like almost like a kind of a... Here's the 6th one. There's a 6th, and then we go back to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 4, 5, 4, 5, 6, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 4, 5, 6. So can you see it has finally appeared in its row form. After that, he sort of twiddles around with, now here's all 6 notes in a kind of Stravinskyan rhythm. So do you see how free it is? This is like taking 6 notes and playing games with those 6 notes and making them form a gradual sort of unveiling phrases, slow, almost ritualistic, like somebody sort of trying to sort of recite a poem or something, but it's coming out in fits and starts. I don't really know how to describe it. Like a kind of incantatory thing. Loki, what are you barking about? I should say at this point that 30 years later, so Boulez was 20 when he wrote the Notation. 30 years later, he'd been to Bayreuth, he'd conducted the ring cycle for the centenary. We're celebrating a centenary of Boulez, but in 1976 it was the centenary of the ring cycle, and Boulez was the conductor in Bayreuth, in Wagner's Festspielhaus. And in the wake of that experience of conducting the ring, I remember hearing Boulez talk about this in London in the Proms in one of these pre-concert talks. He said that looking at the ring inspired him to revisit his own earlier music. And the thing that inspired him in Wagner was this, that Wagner would have these amazing ideas in the 1850s, the original ring material, the motifs, and which you find in Das Rheingold, the first opera in the ring cycle. And then much later, and 20 years later, he was writing Götterdämmerung, the last opera in the cycle, and he'd revisit material he'd written all those years before, and it's much more interesting, much richer. His developmental technique is much more advanced by the end of his life. And it was such an interesting comment on Wagner. It's true, by the way, that Götterdämmerung is an amazing piece because it has all the wisdom of an artist who's really learned how to compose. And to some extent, Boulez felt the same way. He was now a middle-aged man, a bit kind of my age, looking back at the music he wrote when he was 20, seeing a freshness in it and thinking, oh, but I could recompose this. And do loads with it. And so he did. And he created these immense orchestral pieces for a vast orchestra using this sort of simple material that he'd devised at the age of 20, but now it's all complex. And the motif, for example, is then sort of, you're hearing it in different parts of the orchestra bouncing around, different sonorities and different colours. And similarly with the right-hand material, it's kind of being, his word was multiplied, because he liked maths, Boulez. So he'd sort of multiply the musical material and it would sort of explode all over the orchestra. Have a listen to this tiny fragment. For copyright reasons, it will be tiny, but you'll sort of get the gist of it. This is Boulez conducting the Lucerne Academy Orchestra. So all that remains in this short discussion is for me to play the wonderful fourth Notation by Pierre Boulez. Happy birthday, Pierre Boulez. And please leave your comments. I mean, it's his birthday, and I know he's not alive anymore, but let's aim to be respectful. I know I said this at the beginning of the video, Boulez is in some ways controversial, not particularly fashionable figure now, but I would say really important, and we kind of dismiss people of his stature, his calibre, at our peril. We need to bear in mind that these people are important, even if we disagree with them. And I disagree with Boulez about almost everything. Oh, by the way, here's a little thing that I essentially disagree with Boulez about, which is the nature of musical vocabulary. It seems to me that little motif is kind of suggesting a tonal centre, the A flat, simply by virtue of coming back to that note. It almost makes me hear it, certainly not in triadic terms like that, but almost like a Phrygian thing with the tonic there, a sort of embellished A flat. So even when Boulez is reinventing musical vocabulary, it seems to me that in a sense the problem is that it already sounds as if it has a tonic. That's the point I'm going to make. Please feel free to disagree, those of you who are ardent serialists, for example, will tell me that's nonsense, and that's fine. But let's have a respectful dialogue about these matters, and feel free to leave a comment. And I will now play the fourth Notation by Pierre Boulez.